for those of you that might not be aware, there was a select committee today, well, not today, but a couple of days ago now, about the future relationship with the European Union. And oh boy, Jesus Christ. There's a highlight reel somewhere of it, and I urge you to go and watch it because that's just the best part. But watching the whole thing, Jesus Christ. We have said on this channel before that the Brexiteers, and especially the people, the Tories, do not understand the EU. Full stop. They just don't understand how it works and how it has benefited this country. Hence why we are walking into now a no deal. And I definitely think that's what's going to happen. I think that this entire shadow pantomime that's been going on since Boris Johnson got in was the destination that was always that they wanted. They just wanted to go for a no deal, just so that they could, well, as has been said, institute those interesting Henry VIII laws, because those basically mean that these Brexiteers can now come in and just get rid of a ton of protections. You know, you could have rights one day and then lose them on Monday morning. That's literally what could happen. And I've said it, and I'm going to start saying it. I worry that we're not going to see the true agenda from Johnson and Cummings until the start of next year. I think that's when we're going to see the true things. And also, piled on top of that, we're going to actually have to start dealing with Brexit. And as we've seen from recent polls, opinion is starting to turn. I've said a long time ago, if you look back at the Iraq War, before the war, public support was sky high for it. You could always walk out onto the street and find someone that supported the Iraq War. After it, if you went out on the streets, you couldn't find a single person, even if they'd publicly voiced their support for it in the past. No one was for it. I think that's what's going to happen with Brexit. Lots of people, I think, especially now, between now and the end of the year, are suddenly going to find out they've got buyer's remorse. But anyway, back to our select committee. And this comes from the Yorkshire Bylines, and the story on it is 4 years on, the ignorance and the idiocy. Last week's virtual session of the Future Relationship Select Committee has sparked quite a lot of comment after it was revealed that Britain lacked a system or even a plan to handle trucks arriving at Dover. The amazing revelation came from Tim Reardon, head of the EU exit at the port of Dover. He told Barry Sherman, MP for Huddersfield, who had innocently asked if any rehearsals had been carried out, that they hadn't even built the system yet. You hear Mr. Richardson explain how the French have already tested their system twice, while we are still at the stage of making sure that the definition and specification of the system is correct. But the session was even more interesting for another reason: the total ignorance of the EU's mutual recognition of standard agreements. Peter Bourne, the MP for Wellingborough and the leading advocate for Brexit, asked about a possible trade agreement, whether we start with identical standards but gradually diverge with the EU, then applying tariffs if we undercut them. He admitted to finding it very confusing. Tim Reardon then explained that any free trade agreement will be about tariffs and it won't make much of a difference to the extra administrative burden. But what would make the difference, he said, would be an agreement on effective mutual recognition on standards, particularly mutual recognition of health standards. Bone then asked the customs expert Carl Lewson to confirm that he would if that would help. Indeed, saying, "Some of us have argued for a long time that there should be mutual recognition of standards, not the same standards, but the but the acceptance by the EU and by the UK that standards that are in place are going to be the standards of what is acceptable, though they are not the same. Would that help? Stunningly, Larson argues and says that this, one of the vehicles that should be explored by the way of the person behind Smart Borders 2.0 and the failed attempt in the 2018 design to design an invisible border in Ireland. Obviously, nobody read his plan in detail because in talks of passing through the border, opening the gate automatically. This is all jaw-dropping ignorance. 4 years after a near constant debate about Brexit, with all the resources of each of these men at their disposal, particularly Peter Bourne with the House of Commons Library Service, they still do not recognise the reality of Brexit. To understand why, you have to think about the single market and how it works. There are basically two types of goods traded inside the EU. Those produced to a harmonised standard and the centralised EU market and the CE marked, and those which are not, called non-harmonised. They are traded by the EU by mutual recognition standards. This ensures market access for goods that are not or are only partly subject to EU harmonised legislation. It guarantees that any good lawfully sold in one EU country can be sold to another. But this can only work if there is a single court, the European Court of Justice. The common supervision by the Commission, both of which we are withdrawing from. And as research briefing from the House of Commons Library in 2018 explained, the EU has already indicated that it would reject a partnership with the UK based on mutual recognition outside the single market and its enforced mechanisms. Mr. Barnier has stated that the idea of mutual recognition in which the UK and the EU would agree on common regulatory outcomes but have the freedom to set their own rules would not work. In the absence of a common discipline, in the absence of EU law that can override national law, in the absence of common supervision and a common court, there can be no mutual recognition of standards. The EU refers to this as an ecosystem. The reason a common court is needed is that the mutual recognition principle is not conditional, not absolute. It applies unless the target or host state can show a good reason why it should be entitled to rely on its stricter standards to exclude something that is acceptable elsewhere in the EU. If the originating state objects, the case needs to be tested by a court and then one that can override national courts, the European Court of Justice, the anathema to men like Peter Bourne. The mutual recognition principle is sometimes used for country assessments, which are each party to an agreement authorises a body or bodies in each country to check and approve the goods made in one of the territories that meet the standards for sale in another territory. They do not simply accept each other's standards. The mutual recognition principle will be lost at 1 second past midnight on the 1st of January 2020, even though at that point we will still be in complete and perfect alignment with every rule and regulation in the EU. The EU will recognise nothing in British law because it will no longer be under the European Court of Justice and hence beyond their ability to enforce the rules. But note that Peter Bourne is actually asking that we go much further. He wants the EU to recognise our standards even though they're not the same. This is a delusional fantasy. Recognition of each other's standards is a privilege reserved for member states only because they are member states and subject to EU law. Many British companies many British companies may be in for a very unpleasant surprise next year. They will lose the important and automatic right to lawfully sell anything made here in the other EU 27 countries without further approval. From the 1st of January 2021, They will be unable to sell non-harmonised goods under the mutual principle and will need to comply with national laws of each country in which they are sold. The UK government guidance for non-harmonised goods is here, and you can go check it out yourself. The products that might be affected include items like childcare articles, clothing, textiles, footwear, furniture, jewellery, sports accessories. Other examples include foodstuffs, particularly manufactured foods, and food supplements, contact materials, fertilizers, construction products. It's all difficult to find exact figures for how much trade is likely to be affected, but I understand the EU estimates it could be around 20% of the total value of market sales in manufactured goods. This is likely to catch many small businesses who currently sell into the EU using mutual recognition principle, but without the resources to discover all the national rules or to modify products to suit the 27 different market standards. They were already woefully underprepared, as my colleague Edward Michael has pointed out today. The Department of Trade website now lists market for EU exports, but does not mention the EU at all. What was previously a single market has now disappeared, and for British exporters has become 27 separate and individual markets, each with its own rules and regulations for non-harmonised goods. This won't stop exporters, but it will make life difficult and considerably more expensive. And as you go there, that guy, Peter Bone, is, he lays it out fully clear. Even now, 4 years on, Brexiteers still do not understand the EU, and they never did. Otherwise, they wouldn't be asking to leave it.